Good evening. I'm Dr. Matt Wedel, and I'm excited to get to share with you some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing in Utah, finding new fossils of giant dinosaurs like Brachiosaurus and other big long-necked dinosaurs. I am an associate professor of anatomy at Western University of Health Sciences in Pomona, California, and I think that sometimes takes people by surprise that someone who teaches human anatomy at a med school would also be a paleontologist. But I came to anatomy through comparative anatomy, which is the study of the anatomy of all kinds of animals. And I've gotten to dissect some really interesting critters like this rhea and that hyena and that alligator and that pigeon. And so my training is broadly in animal anatomy. Human anatomy is a subset of comparative anatomy. We just focus on one species. And there are lots of roads to paleontology, and some people come to it through the study of rocks and strata, through geology, but I came to paleontology as an anatomist. So I'm interested in these extinct animals, how they were put together in life, and how we can put them back together from the bits that Mother Nature leaves us after the process of fossilization and erosion. And right up front, I want to dispel a myth, which is that scientists are these lone geniuses who go out and make discoveries or formulate ideas all by themselves. That's how lots of us would like to see ourselves. I certainly am not a lone genius, nor do I actually know any lone geniuses myself. In my experience, science happens like this. And along the way tonight, I'll tell you the story of that bone and how I got to be in that trailer. But everyone in that photo participated, even the kids, and including people who aren't in that photo, including the person who took the photo. So science is a collaborative process, and it works best when we work together. So right up front, I'm going to thank all the folks that made this talk possible. Over on the left column are all the folks that have been digging out at the site that we call Brachiosaur Gulch. So everyone who's listed there has sweat equity in the images that I'm about to show you. On the upper right are friends and colleagues who have helped me think more clearly about these giant animals, in particular Brachiosaurus. And we've also gotten funding from the Utah Fieldhouse of Natural History State Park Museum and from Canyonlands Natural History Association, which is based in Moab and funds research throughout the Canyonlands region. From my own department has given me money to come out and work, and from Brian Ing's Patreon supporters. So our work is inexpensive, but it doesn't cost nothing, and so we're super grateful to the people who make it possible. This is Brian Ing again, and this is Brian Ing the way that I see him most of the time, because he moves faster than I do. And so as we're stomping around in the deserts of Utah, he usually finds most of the fossils, including the most exciting ones that I'm going to tell you about tonight, because he's just ahead of me, and so I'm usually following along behind. This is John Foster. He's my other closest collaborator on this project. Here he is out near Brachiosaur Gulch. This is a fossil stream bed. So there's this fine-grained white sandstone, and this is a cross-section of an ancient river that silted up with much coarser, cobblier, pebbly stuff. So we've got this nice preserved ancient river cutting into what was at the time softer sediment. And this is all happening in the late Jurassic period. So the area where we're working, the strata are probably right around 150 million years old. That's a nice round number. And we find lots of stuff out there, not just dinosaurs. We find fossil plants and fossil wood, petrified wood, including this part of a fossilized tree that has some preserved growth rings. So we can possibly get like paleo rainfall and maybe some paleoclimate data potentially from this. We find other fossil plants like this cycad. But what's drawn most of our attention and what we're most excited about are the dinosaurs. And sometimes they're not hard to find. Sometimes their bones are just sitting right out there on the surface, like this femur or thigh bone of a long-necked sauropod. And now that I've mentioned the word sauropod, we got to stop and talk a little bit about the dinosaur family tree. So we have, outside of dinosaurs, there are things like pterosaurs that aren't even on the slide that are related to dinosaurs, but they're not dinosaurs. Dinosaurs divide into two big groups. The ornithischians or bird-hipped dinosaurs, which are the horned and armored and duck-billed dinosaurs and their relatives. And then the Saurischian dinosaurs, which include the vulgar overstudied theropods, things like Velociraptor and T-Rex, and all living birds. And God's noblest creatures, the Sauropodomorphs, which started out back in the Triassic as these dog-sized bipedal omnivores, but very rapidly got their act together and evolved into the giant four-legged titanic herbivores that we know and love. And this is the way that we often find sauropod bones out in the desert. This is a neck vertebra, and it has been broken in half by this boulder. Other ones get broken by or get exposed by erosion, and we can see that it's got a complex internal structure. And this is pretty cool because these giant dinosaurs, like lots of living birds, have air-filled bones. And you can take a vertebra from a bird, a modern bird. Some of them don't have air-filled bones, things that dive like penguins, but most of them do have air in their bones. And if you CT scan them, you see this cool honeycomb of internal air spaces. And you can take vertebrae from sauropod dinosaurs and other dinosaurs and CT scan them and find a similar complex of air spaces inside. And this is not just in exotic birds, this is in humble things that are really close to us, like chickens and turkeys. And at the end of the talk, I will talk a little bit more about how you can see some of this stuff for yourself in your own kitchen. And the air-filled bones were useful to the dinosaurs because they're lighter than non-air-filled bones. And this is probably one of the things that allowed them to get so big. So that's me with the mounted skeleton of Brachiosaurus that's outside the Field Museum in Chicago. And I scaled a world record giraffe. So a world record giraffe could just barely peek over the shoulders of Brachiosaurus. But the giraffe is a mammal, and so it's like us. Its bones are filled with marrow, all except for the sinuses in its skull. And so they're comparatively heavy. Whereas for Brachiosaurus and the other sauropods, most of the vertebral column, the spinal column, could be full of air. And then the limb bones, usually in contrast, were pretty dense. So rather than having their skeleton all be roughly the same density like ours, they were putting the bone where they needed it most into their supporting structures in their limbs. And then the vertebrae and even the ribs could be full of air to give them a lighter upper works and give them a long boom to move that head around to gobble up all the leaves that they could get. Now, those air spaces in the vertebrae give them complex shapes, and that's useful to us as paleontologists because it means that we can tell these things apart based on their vertebrae. And I had to start figuring this out back when I was a graduate student. These are some pages from my notebook when I was trying to figure out how do you tell Diplodocus from Apatosaurus, from Barosaurus, from Brachiosaurus. Barosaurus and Brachiosaurus in particular both have really long neck vertebrae with lots of different air pockets, and they can be easy to confuse. And so I had to teach myself how to distinguish these things. And the vertebrae of sauropods aren't just complex on the outside, they're also complex on the inside with different size and shapes of cavities, like in the CT scans I showed you a little bit. And crucially, these are not the same in all sauropods. In fact, their internal structures differ pretty dramatically. So Haplocanthosaurus is pretty simple, a couple of cavities up in the ball on the front of the vertebra, and then just a couple of essentially dents on either side. Camarasaurus, getting a little bit more complex. Apatosaurus, now we're getting a lot more complex. Brachiosaurus is crazy. So we've got some unfamiliar terms here. So a foramen is a hole that goes into the bone. A fossa is just a dent on the outside of the bone that doesn't go anywhere. And camerae are the two big paired cavities on either side. And camelli are the little spaces, the little honeycomb spaces that we see everywhere else. So as they get more complex, they get kind of irregular and a little bit more impressionistic. Barosaurus is nuts. This is a big neck vertebra of Barosaurus in the museum in Yale, and erosion kindly sheared off the front end of the ball at the front of the vertebra, and we can see this total honeycomb of just crazy complex air spaces and thin strips of bone separating them. So sometimes we put these things through CT scanners to see their internal structure, and sometimes nature does the job for us with erosion and with breakage and things like that. I myself am a big fan of broken vertebrae because that means I can see inside for cheap. So that gets us back to these things that we find in the field. So in this case, this boulder that is about 6 or 8 feet across and probably weighs a few tons, fell down off this cliff, cracked in half, and this half rolled 180 degrees away. So this vertebra and this vertebra, that's the same thing. They're split in two, and we've got the two halves now sticking out of the two halves of this boulder. And we're pretty sure that this is from Comparasaurus, and I will walk you through the logic of why that is. So first of all, it's a long bone with a ball up front and a socket in the back and some air spaces inside. So it's a vertebra, and it's too big to be from anything other than a sauropod, one of these long necks. And there's these bits of bone out on either side. We call those the cervical ribs. And these things are way out from the rest of the vertebra. And there's a couple of different sauropods in the late Jurassic in North America that have the cervical ribs so widely spaced, Apatosaurus and Comparasaurus. But in Apatosaurus, the cervical ribs are big and thick, and in Comparasaurus, they're nice and skinny, and that one is nice and skinny. And the internal structure looks about right for Comparasaurus. There's about 3 cavities there at the front of the vertebra. There's not like 12 or 20 or 100, but there's more than 2. So it's too complex to be Haplocanthosaurus, not complex enough probably to be Apatosaurus or Diplodocus. It's got the wide cervical ribs that says Comparasaurus or Apatosaurus. So if it's Comparasaurus or Apatosaurus and it's not Apatosaurus, it's probably Comparasaurus. That's our best guess to date. This probably is Apatosaurus. This is another vertebra that's sticking out of a cliff, and we'll blank out the cliff and highlight the vertebra so you can see the bone. This one came to rest upside down. So we'll flip it over, and this one is the ball at the front end, and there's kind of a step here that's a little hard to see, and that's these 2 processes that stick forward at the front and a little bit of that loop of bone that makes the cervical rib. And so it turns out that all my early training, CT scanning dinosaur bones to look at the air spaces inside, turned out to be good practice for recognizing these things when they're sticking out of cliffs and they're only halfway complete. And incidentally, if you're looking at these wacky shapes and you're thinking that would make a pretty darn good spaceship, you're not alone. For you Star Wars fans out there, if you watch Clone Wars, there's a set of 3 episodes set on the planet Umbara, and this is the Umbaran Starfighter, and it is based on an Apatosaurus vertebra. My colleague Mike Taylor tracked down the artist that designed this thing and confirmed that he went to the California Academy of Sciences, saw an Apatosaurus vertebra on display, thought, hey, that would make a cool spaceship, and thus we have the Umbaran Starfighter. So dinosaur bones do make good spaceships sometimes. This one's pretty cool. This is one of my favorites. This is a dorsal vertebra, so not from the neck. This is from the back, a vertebra with a rib. So there's sort of the cup at the back. Here's the hole for the spinal cord. There are these things that would go up and out to the ribs. There's a little bit of a rib there. There's part of one of the ribs hanging down here. But this is a really tall, narrow vertebra, and it's got these processes going up and out. If we tilt it up like that, it doesn't look like Apatosaurus or Diplodocus. They tend to have these processes going sideways, so the vertebra looks like a T. Haplocanthosaurus, uniquely among the Sauropod dinosaurs in the Morrison Formation, has this tall, arching space over the hole for the spinal cord. We can see that right here, and it has these processes going up and out to support the ribs. We can see that right there. So we're virtually certain that this is Haplacanthosaurus, and that there's probably more of this in the cliff waiting for us to get it out. This vertebra is sheared in half by erosion, and it's crazy complex inside, with all these little irregular spaces with some really thin bone. Some of those pieces of bone, this is about 1.5 feet long. Some of those pieces of bone are less than 1 millimeter thick. And based on how thin those are and how crazy complex the internal structure is, we think this is probably Barosaurus. So just based on isolated bones, we think there's a good diversity of sauropods out at our site, including Camarasaurus, Haplacanthosaurus, Apatosaurus, Barosaurus. And I want to make a few points here. One is that we do find things other than sauropods. This is Brian. Now you get to see his front side again. He's super happy here because this is a plate of Stegosaurus. And this chunk of rock fell away from here. And so it split basically right along the plate. So that's one stegosaur plate. And you can even see little lines for blood vessels that were running through that plate, kind of nourishing it and nourishing the covering of protein, keratin, that was on the outside of it. Same stuff as is in your fingernails and the claws of other animals. So we do find things other than sauropods. The second thing is I've been showing you our wins. And it may seem like we walk up to every bone out there and we're like, oh, that's a neck vertebra of Haplacanthosaurus. Sometimes we don't know what stuff is. So this one was found by Dr. Susie Maidment. She brought it to our attention. And John and Brian and I have been out there with Jesse Adderholt, and we've looked at this thing and crawled up and down it. And there are crazy complex bones in cross-section that are probably vertebrae. This thing might be an upper arm bone, or it might be part of the pelvis. John Foster has been working in the Morrison mostly on sauropods for 2 or 3 decades. I've been working on sauropods for 2.5 decades, and we both scratch our heads over this one. So don't think that it's all us walking up to stuff and knowing exactly what it is. Most of the time we don't. We've logged close to 100 places where there are fossils sticking out of the ground, and out of those we've gotten solid IDs on probably 6, and those are the ones that I just showed you. So there's a lot of work still to be done, but it's a fun intellectual puzzle, and we are learning more about that ecosystem and about the animals that were in it. And the third point I want to make is we didn't find the first dinosaur bones out there. We or our colleagues have found most of the dinosaur bones out there, but the very first one was found by a photographer who did the right thing and called the local BLM field office and brought it to the attention of Rebecca Hunt Foster, who was at the time the BLM paleontologist for Southern Utah, and she's now the park paleontologist at Dinosaur National Monument. And that's how scientists got to be working on these bones. Let me tell you a little story. This is Paige Wyron. She was out hiking in the desert, not too far from our site, and she found this bone sticking out of a riverbank. And she did the same thing. She called the local BLM field office so paleontologists could go out there and get this thing. I was lucky enough to be on that dig. There I am in my swimming trunks because my other foot is literally in the river. It was the most comfortable dinosaur dig I've ever been on. And here's Brian Eng, and we are with John Foster and Rebecca Hunt Foster, and Paige Wyron herself came out to help dig this thing up. We got it out of the ground, and it's now on display in the Museum of Moab. And you can go to Moab, go to the museum downtown, and go touch this bone. And it has been the first dinosaur bone that a lot of school kids and tourists have ever gotten to see and touch, because Paige did the right thing and let people know about this. So most of our fossils that we're finding are on public lands. The public lands belong to all of us. They are the collective property of the citizens of the United States, and we should all be invested in making sure that they stay that way. So I've shown you lots of bones in cross section sticking out of really hard sandstone. And then in May of 2018, I was out there with Brian Eng and Tut Tran, who's doing some work there. And Brian says, "Hey, Matt, you better get over here. I think there's something big." And so I walk over, and this was sticking out of the dirt. And this is the end of a bone, and it's about 1.5 feet wide. And there was a suspicious looking bump over there. So we went and cleared that off. And it turned out to be a humerus of Brachiosaurus. And we went back in June with John Foster, and he brought his daughter Ruby, and we cleared the thing off and covered it in glue and started formulating a plan for getting it out of the ground. So there's Brian with his find. And we weren't able to just go out and dig this thing up because it's down in a gulch. We call it Brachiosaur Gulch for a reason. There's this spill of boulders. There's this hillside that's eroding down on top of it. We're about 20 feet below the top of the gulch and still about 20 feet below the floor of the gulch. So it's on this fairly steep slope. And it really was not clear how we were going to get this gigantic bone out of the ground, or if we were going to get this gigantic bone out of the ground. But while we were there in June of 2019, Brian and Ruby started, they saw about a hand-size spot of bone sticking out underneath this juniper tree, and they started brushing it off and digging around it, and pretty soon they had another chunk of bone that was 1.5 feet wide, and that was the top end, the shoulder end of the other humerus, the other arm bone. So all of you watching this, human beings, vertebrates with limbs, we have a single bone in our upper arm, the humerus. In us, it's about, well, as big as your arm, as your upper arm. In Brachiosaurus, it's about 6 feet long or more. And we found most of the rest of this one in pieces tumbled down the wash. So we were able to hike that one out in bits, but our baby, the beautiful one, the intact one, was still in the ground. Now, this is a good point to talk about Brachiosaurus. Brachiosaurus is famous. It's in Jurassic Park. It's the dinosaur that everybody sees first when they arrive on the island. And it's in Jurassic World. It's the one on the dock that gets blown away by lava in easily the saddest scene in movie history. And it's in Dinosaur Train, and it's in Walking with Dinosaurs. And it's basically, if a show has dinosaurs in it, it probably has Brachiosaurus. And so from that, you would think that this dinosaur being so super famous, that we would know it completely. Surely we must have multiple complete skeletons of Brachiosaurus. No, this is what we have. Brian Ing put this together. This isn't one partial skeleton of Brachiosaurus. This is all the partial skeletons of Brachiosaurus. So the skull is from a quarry in Colorado, I believe. Those vertebrae are from Dry Mesa, Colorado. One of the upper arm bones and a couple of the ribs, and not the shoulder blade, but that bone and some of the backbone and the femur are from the type specimen, the one that the name is attached to. There's another humerus and a radius and one of the bones of the hand from another specimen. There's a great big foot that is from a Brachiosaurid, an animal in this family, and it's from the late Jurassic of North America. And so we're all assuming that it's Brachiosaurus. Brachiosaurus isn't the only one. There are others around the world that make up this family, and some of them we know better than Brachiosaurus. So we're using comparative anatomy. We're using what we do know of other animals to fill in the gaps for what we don't know. But you can see that there are some pretty big blank spots in the map. So our picture of Brachiosaurus is mostly informed by its relative Giraffatitan, which lived at about the same time in Tanzania in East Africa. And this is the mounted skeleton of Giraffatitan in Berlin, and it would be easy to overlook me down there staring up at this thing. This photo was taken by my colleague Mike Taylor. The museum staff were very kind and gave us ladders and access so we could get up and measure this thing up close. And the really mind-bending thing is, if you look here in the shoulder, that bone is the scapula, the shoulder blade, and that bone is the coracoid. And in an adult sauropod, those are fused. And in this animal, they're not. And they're also not fused in the original type specimen of Brachiosaurus, the one that's me for scale. So I come not quite up to this animal's elbow. So as big as these animals are, they probably weren't full grown. And that's true of a lot of the big dinosaurs that you see in museums. We do have evidence that they got bigger than this. So there is one leg bone, the fibula from the shin of an animal that's a little bit, it's about 12 or 13% bigger than this one. So that probably might be an actual adult, full grown, and this one was still growing when it died, despite the fact that it's 45 feet tall and 70 feet long and probably weighed 35 or 40 tons. So here's that mounted specimen outside the Field Museum in Chicago again with me for scale. The humerus is the upper arm bone. That was the humerus. This is the humerus that was found with this thing in 1900 in western Colorado, right outside of Fruita, as Dr. McHugh mentioned. Another humerus, a second humerus, was discovered in western Colorado at Potter Creek in 1955. This is just a fiberglass cast of that humerus. The original is on display in the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. So that was it until 2019. We had one upper arm bone from Colorado from 1900. We had another one from Colorado from 1955, and all the rest of the various brachiosaur bits did not include the humerus until Brian found that one in Brachiosaur Gulch. And there's me lying down next to it before we got the jacket on it and got it out of the ground. And incidentally, if you're wondering why you always see paleontologists lying down next to giant dinosaur bones, there's two reasons. One, because it's awesome, and two, because at this point it's a tradition. This is that original humerus that came out of Colorado in 1900, and that's one of the workers lying down next to it. Maybe he's taking a nap, maybe he's being awesome. I vote for both. So we find this thing in May and just have to cover it up and camouflage the site and go away because we have to come back with John Foster in June of 2019 and figure out a plan. So the photo that I showed you earlier of Brian Eng and Ruby Foster looking at it, we uncovered it, we covered it with glue, and then we didn't know how to get it out of the ground and back safely to the road. We couldn't just bring in a bulldozer and make a road because there are endangered plants at the site, and because frankly I don't know that a bulldozer would have helped that much anyway, because a bulldozer can make a road, it can't make the gulch into a flat, comfortable surface. So we were going to have to find something else. So we finally got back out in October of 2019 with a plan. And if you're thinking that that's a long time to leave this thing in the ground, yeah, I agree. And we were all pretty nervous because remember, this is on a surface that's eroding. The end of it that we found, that Brian saw sticking out of the ground, was already starting to shatter from wind and rain and freeze-thaw cycles in the wintertime. And fossil poaching is a real problem. One of the dinosaurs that Dr. McHugh mentioned that I've worked on, Brontomirus, the fossils that we described from that thing are what were left over after fossil poachers illegally removed the rest of it. So what we got is pretty good, but I'd sure like to know what we didn't get. So for lots of reasons, we were nervous and anxious to get this thing out of the ground. It was the first brachiosaur humerus discovered in more than half a century. It was by far the farthest west, since the other two are from Colorado. There are brachiosaur bits from Utah, but not a lot, and certainly none this far west. And it was our first evidence of Brachiosaurus in this ecosystem. We'd found lots of the other famous dinosaurs, things like Apatosaurus and Camarasaurus and Stegosaurus, but Brachiosaurus is one of the rarest, ironically. So we finally get back out there in October 2019. We get a plaster jacket on it. Here's the crew. So in the purple here is Yara Haridi. There's John Foster. I don't know what he just said, but Brian Eng and I do not look happy. That's Tom Howells, who volunteers at the field house in Vernal. That's Ruby. We're all working on, in this case, it wasn't a hot day. This was a cold day, and the wind was blowing, and we're trying to get this thing jacketed up. We got some 2x4s in there to help brace this thing, and we got it flipped. So With us here are Wes and Thane Bartlett, the Bartlett family. You'll understand why they were with us on the dig in a couple more slides. Flipping this thing over is like any jacket flip is always a nervous time, because if you haven't done your job correctly, then what happens is that the plaster jacket flips over and the bone falls out in kibble. But in this case, the flip went just fine. And there's Brian with his baby. And we were even able to take some of the rock down off the back to make this thing a little bit lighter. It still ended up being about 1,100 pounds once we got the back jacket on. There's a little bit of the bone that was face down in the ground. It was in really good condition. I'll show you pictures of it later. So now we've got this 1,100 pound jacket stuck halfway down a steep slope in the middle of nowhere. And we have to get it out. Enter Ruby Foster. At that time, I believe she was 9 years old, and she is obsessed with horses. And while we were there in June, we were looking at this thing before we had it in a jacket, and we're thinking about how we can get it out. Could we put it on a car hood and slide it out? Were we going to have to shell out for a helicopter? Helicopters are expensive, and that's a whole complicated thing. There's no very good place for one to land right around there. And Ruby says, could we use horses? And John got a faraway look in his eye, and the wheels started to turn. And so that's what we ended up doing. These are the Clydesdales, Molly and Darla, and they were brought out to the site by the Bartletts, Wes and Risha and their kids from Vernal. And we got the jacket on a cart, and we hooked the cart up to, I say we, Wes Bartlett, hooked the cart up to first one horse at a time to get it out of the gulch. And there we are, almost up to the top. This is the most majestic photo of my butt that anyone ever has or ever will take. And there's Wes, there's one of the horses, there's Thane helping push. We get up to the top. Here's the whole Bartlett family, Wes and Risha and Thane and Jaylee and Kaler and Coben. And let me tell you, every person in that family worked. We had no extra human beings on that dig. Everybody worked, even the kids. The kids helped us with the big bone. They jacketed a small piece of bone that was in the way before we did the flip. Everybody came to work, and everybody worked hard. So big shout outs to the Bartlett family and to Molly and Darla, the Clydesdales. It was super, super satisfying as a fan of big animals to get to use big animals to haul a piece of a truly immense animal out of the desert. So we got it up to the road, and then we put the jacket on this thing that Wes calls a sled. Now this contraption is, I don't know, about 6 or 7 feet square. It's made out of I-beams and 2x8s bolted on, and its only concession to streamlining is a round piece of pipe up front so it can roll over things a little bit more easily. The pipe doesn't turn, it just makes it slide better. The thing weighs about 500 pounds. And we joked with Wes that you can call that a sled, but if you don't have Clydesdales, it's not a sled because it's not going anywhere. It's a building foundation. So we put the 1,100 pound jacket on top of the 500 pound sled and hooked up Molly and Darla. Keep in mind that each one of those horses weighs 1,800 pounds, and they can pull many times their own body weight. So we've got 3,600 pounds of horse pulling about 1,600 pounds of jacket plus sled. It was no contest. I've driven this road out near the quarry many times, and let me tell you, it is noticeably smoother since the horses dragged the jacket out, because rocks that I used to have to crawl around in my four-wheel drive SUV no longer exist. Rocks like this size were just exploding into powder as this thing went over them. So we got it back, got it on a trailer with some helpful suggestions from Yara, whose family is from Egypt, and we're trying to get this thing up onto the trailer, and it's just not going up the ramp. We had a boat winch, we had a pry bar. We could not get this thing to move because we couldn't use the horses anymore. Everything that we could use the horses for went fast and easy. Everything that we had to do just with human power was slow and awkward and dangerous and not fun. We couldn't get this thing to move. And Yara said, you know, when my people were building the pyramids, we used round sticks underneath the big blocks of rock to get them to move. And so we had a round stick, and Brian took some square sticks and a knife and made some more, and we made some rollers and put them under the jacket and finally got this thing up on the trailer. And I think that is about as relieved as I've ever been in my life, other than possibly the birth of my son. We got it back to the lab at the Utah Fieldhouse in Vernal. So there's their mounted Diplodocus skeleton out in the atrium, and these are the floor-to-ceiling glass windows that look in on the prep lab. So if you go to Vernal, you can go to the Fieldhouse and you can see this thing. So there it is in its jacket. There's me, Brian, Yara, Rebecca Hunt Foster, John Foster. We're all happy and relieved to have this thing safely back home. The Fieldhouse did an open house a couple months later, and the Bartletts were able to be there, and they brought Molly and Darla so people could meet the real heroes of the story, the horses. And by that time, the jacket had been opened, and we could see some of the quality of the bone, which is very good. This is a nice specimen. We're going to do some serious science with this thing. So that's the nice, complete right humerus that we got out in one piece. Here are the chunks of the left humerus. And we're still finding pieces of bone from this one in that wash. We found some this summer, and John took them back to Vernal and was able to get some fits. So we're still kind of Tetrising this thing together, and we're hopeful that we'll have like 80 or 90% of the matching left humerus, almost certainly from the same individual. Keep in mind that up until a couple years ago, there were only 2 Brachiosaur humeri in the world. There was one from 1900, there was one from 1955, and now we've got 2 more. And so for the first time, we have them from the same individual. Now, when we were out in 2019, we got the humerus from here, and there was a little piece of bone sticking out that we didn't have time to deal with. So we put a little tiny plaster cap on it, and we decided we'd have to come back later and deal with it. And we figured that we would do that in 2020. And you all know what happened. We had a global pandemic that we're still coming out of. And so we all sat home in 2020 and didn't go dig. We got back out there this summer. This is my research student, Kaylin Kay, who is in medical school, but a very ferocious anatomist and interested in all kinds of things. So she came out and helped us dig. And what we found, that little piece of bone turned out to be the end of the rib that attaches to the vertebra. And this is the end that hangs down that probably had some kind of cartilage connection to the breastbone or sternum. And this thing is about 6 feet 4 inches long. And it's clearly from Brachiosaurus. No other critter out there has ribs that big, and it's from the same hole essentially as the humerus. So we assume that the 2 humeri and the rib all belong to the same individual. And I would love right now to tell you the story of how we got this rib out right then and didn't have to leave it and come back because of something awful. But that's not a story I get to tell because we got chased out by storms. So one of the folks who was with us in July is Tom Howells, who volunteers at the Fieldhouse. He was there for the humerus extraction. And there's John. We got the plaster cap on the top of the vertebra, and then we kept popping up here, and it was blue skies overhead, and we were completely encircled 360 degrees by storm clouds. And when hills that I knew the distance to in the background started to disappear behind sheets of rain, we decided we weren't going to get this thing out in July. So once again, we had to put a tarp on it, cover it to protect it from the elements, camouflage it to protect it from fossil poachers, and walk out and hope for the best. And I'm happy to report that last month in September, we were able to get back out there and finish the job. This is my colleague, Thea Nally, Dr. Nally, who's another anatomist here at Western. She usually goes to Africa and digs for Australopithecines, but she'd always wanted to go on a dinosaur dig. So she came, and like everybody who comes to Brachiosaur Gulch, she worked. So we got the rest of the jacket on the rib. We got it flipped and onto a cart. There's John Foster, there's Colton Snyder, there's Dr. Jesse Adderholt. And this one went much smoother, partly because this jacket weighed a fraction of what the humerus did. and partly because we knew exactly what to do now, even though we didn't have horses. We retraced our steps from 2019 and got this thing back up to the Jeep that John and Colton had come down from Vernal in, and it just fit. So with this end of the jacket all the way back here at the gate, the long part of the rib goes up between the two front seats, sitting on top of the center console. So there was no getting like gum or CDs or anything out of the center console while that thing was sitting there. But they got it safely back to the field house in Vernal as well. So I've shown you lots of pieces of individual bones. To remind you of how big these animals are, they're stupid big. This is a mounted cast skeleton of Brachiosaurus at the North American Museum of Ancient Life in Lehi, Utah. And that's KLNK for scale. We went to the museum after we'd been digging so she could see and get some perspective on what she'd been digging up. So that's a cast of the humerus that came out of the ground with a type specimen back in 1900. And she's not a small person. She's 5'8". She can just barely get her fingertips on the elbow. This is Brian Ing's painting of what we think Brachiosaurus might have looked like, with our humerus, the one from Brachiosaur Gulch, and Wes Bartlett, and Molly, the Clydesdale, and his son Coben for scale. People always ask about these things on the neck. We don't know if sauropods had these things or if Brachiosaurus had these things, but they had long necks, and lots of birds with long necks use them as a billboard. So it seems crazier to assume that no sauropods ever had interesting display structures than to assume that some of them did. We're not going to know exactly what these animals looked like in life, but if we assume that they were all dull and gray and had nothing interesting going on, we'll be wrong, but we'll also be boring. So they were living animals. They had lives. They had to find mates. They had to do all of the stuff that living animals do. It's reasonable to assume that they were just as varied and interesting and colorful as a lot of animals that we have with us today. So hopefully now you're thinking, all right, Matt, you've convinced me. What I need to do is quit my job and pursue dinosaurs full-time, particularly brachiosaurs. How do I go about that? So one of the things you can do is get yourself to the field house in Vernal, Utah, and you can see the bones that I've been talking about. So this is me in July. There's our humerus that we got out of the ground back in 2019. We're still working on it, but you can see it is in gorgeous shape. This is a great big muscle attachment. This is where the deltoid and the pectoralis muscles attached. And the rib is there now too. And this is the prep lab. So if you go look through the windows, you'll probably see them both in there. And the field house has other nice stuff, including the skeleton of Diplodocus, which is not bad as small dinosaurs go. That was a joke for everybody who doesn't work on sauropods. You can also go to our host institution for tonight's talk, Dinosaur Journey in Fruita, Colorado. They've got a mounted cast right arm of Brachiosaurus, and they've got some really nice historical information about Brachiosaurus because it came out of the ground just a few miles from Fruita. And that museum has lots of awesome dinosaur specimens to see and to touch, including some bones from Apatosaurus that got chomped on by meat-eating dinosaurs like Allosaurus. You can see and feel those bite marks on the giant bones for yourself. So go check them out. If you'd like to know more, my colleague Mike Taylor and I run a very geeky blog, Sauropod Vertebra Picture of the Week, or SVPOW, where we yap about dinosaurs, and you can also get links to all of our papers there. And here I'm going to make myself either really popular or radically unpopular with all the parents and uncles and aunts and grandparents out there, and teachers too. Because we're coming up on Thanksgiving and Christmas, there's going to be a lot of turkeys, which means there's going to be hordes and hordes of unwanted turkey necks. And a lot of the things that I've talked about in here are not super exotic things. You can take turkey necks and clean them up, and with some sandpaper, see the internal structure, see those cool air spaces that completely fill these things like a honeycomb. So teachers, folks who run after school programs, if you need to occupy kids with a safe, fun STEM activity, looking inside the bones of living dinosaurs to see some of the same structures that we find in extinct giant dinosaurs is pretty good fun. I also have a post on there about how to take a chicken humerus and make a scale model Brachiosaurus humerus if you need one for your Jurassic World Legacy Collection Brachiosaurus toy, which I assume you all have or will have shortly. If you still want to know more, as Dr. McHugh mentioned, I wrote a book with Mark Hallett called The Sauropod Dinosaurs, Life in the Age of Giants. And John Foster, just this year, has the second edition of his book, Jurassic West, which is an encyclopedic but highly readable and obscenely well illustrated look at the late Jurassic world of the whole American West. So highly recommend that one. Brian Eng, who supplied most of the art here, has a great website, don'tmesswithdinosaurs.com, and also a paleo art YouTube channel. And in particular, I highly recommend that you go check out Jurassic Reimagined, Part 1, Giants in the Sands of Time, which is a video that he and I wrote and he shot and scored. And it is the first of 3 that are explaining and taking you through these gorgeous landscapes and the fossils that we find there and what we think they mean for our picture of how life was changing in the Jurassic in the American West. What's next for us? We're going back to Brachiosaur Gulch. We're hoping that there are more bones there, and there are definitely other things. There are plants as well. So this is a piece of that mudstone that the Brachiosaur is in, and all of this dark stuff is carbonized plant material. And we're hoping that we can find recognizable pieces, things like scales from pine cones or leaves from ferns that will tell us more about that environment, because we don't just want the giant dinosaurs, we want the whole world. This is one of Brian Eng's paintings showing a couple of Brachiosaurus and some Camarasaurs and some Apatosaurs and a Diplodocus and some Stegosaurs. All of these things lived in Utah and Colorado and other states in the American West. And it seems almost unbelievable that so many giant animals could share the same ecosystem, but we know that they did, and we'd like to know more about why. So that's the question that motivates us, not just what were the individual animals like, but how did they coexist, and what was their world like? So there's some ways to get involved, some things to go see online and in the real world now that we can do that again. Thank you for your time and attention. I think we have some time for questions, and I'll be happy to entertain them.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Wedel. That was a wonderful talk. We do have a question in the chat from Jordan. Jordan had a question about the air pockets inside the vertebrae, and he writes, when the bones are growing, do the air pockets grow randomly, or is there usually a pattern?
Oh, that is a fantastic question.
I thought you might like that one.
Yeah, so if you look at something like a turkey, the spaces inside seem pretty haphazard. And as I showed you earlier, in the very simple ones, the vertebrae are just sort of shaped like an I-beam or an anchor cross section with just a couple of big spaces, and then as time goes on, they get more and more complex. We think that those struts of bone inside are there to sort of resist mechanical stress and strain, but we're just starting to explore that question of, is it random and there's just enough of them that it works out, or is there some higher level organization? So if you section the bones of most animals, including us, there are definite patterns to the way that those things are laid out. And I think we're just getting to the point with high resolution CT scans and 3D models that we can start answering that question. So the answer for now is we suspect that there's an organization there, but that's a pretty hard thing to demonstrate. And I think we're just getting to the threshold of being able to do that technologically. So fingers crossed that someone will sort that out in the near future. Good question. What's next?
Oh, Matt, next question is, have you ever found a Brachiosaurus coprolite?
So a coprolite, coprolite means poop stone, and it is literally fossilized poop. And we have coprolites from lots of different kinds of dinosaurs, but rarely can we tell exactly what dinosaur made the coprolite. So I've never found a very big coprolite. I've found little ones that were like the size of my hand, which is still pretty big for a poop, but not very big for a poop from an animal the size of a whale. I know that people have found coprolites like the size of beach balls, or roughly that size, basketballs anyway, that we assume are from sauropods. But I don't know that we've ever found any from Brachiosaurus specifically, and we probably wouldn't be able to tell. One of the few dinosaurs that we can definitely say that we found a coprolite from is Tyrannosaurus Rex, because in its ecosystem, it was the only predator that was gigantic. And there are T-Rex poops that are about 2 feet long, and they are full of bone shards and undigested chunks of muscle. So they're definitely from a meat eater, and they're from a meat eater that was big enough to make a 2-foot long poop. So it wasn't a little guy like Velociraptor. And the only one big enough to do that was Tyrannosaurus Rex. But I don't know of very many other cases where we can say definitely this poop came from that dinosaur. But we are always excited when we get dinosaur poop because we get evidence of what they were eating. And some interesting discoveries have come out that way. For example, people assumed for a long time that grass didn't evolve until after the age of dinosaurs was over, until the age of mammals. But some sauropod poops from India had, I believe they were from India, had fossil traces of grass inside, which showed that grass had actually started to evolve way back in the Cretaceous period. So we can definitely learn a lot from coprolites. I would love to get a Brachiosaurus coprolite. If we found a 2-foot long poop or a 3-foot long poop that was full of pine needles and bark back in Brachiosaur Gulch, we'd probably have a pretty good suspicion that it came from Brachiosaurus, but we haven't found one yet.
So Matt, our next question is from Georgia, who's 7 years old and very excited for your talk. She wants to know what the primary difference is between Brachiosaurus and Apatosaurus.
That's a fantastic question. So let me get back to the Brachiosaurus skeleton. You can't see the whole thing here, but the bones of Brachiosaurus are really slender. They look wide from side to side, but from front to back, like the limb bones are pretty slender. Even though Brachiosaurus is huge and tall, and the body took up a lot of space, the individual bones are pretty slender compared to those of other dinosaurs. So Brachiosaurus was not built like a football player. Brachiosaurus was built like a ballerina. Apatosaurus, on the other hand, was built like a football player. Apatosaurus limb bones are crazy thick. So Apatosaurus, this is going to sound mean. I don't mean it that way. But Apatosaurus was fat. It had a fat body, had a big fat neck. Its neck was super wide. Its bones were really thick and strong. And that's actually pretty interesting because most sauropods, most long necks, were trying to be as light as possible, at least their vertebrae. And Apatosaurus, even the vertebrae are really thick and heavy. And the neck vertebrae have these big things that look like clubs sticking off them. And so almost alone out of all the sauropods who are evolving lighter skeletons and lighter vertebrae, Apatosaurus takes a hard left and goes and does the opposite thing and evolves really heavy bones, and in particular, really heavy vertebrae. And we think maybe they were using them to whack on each other, that they were using them for combat, to fight. There has to be an explanation. Why, if your whole evolutionary lineage is towards getting lighter and lighter and lighter, would you suddenly get really heavy and stick clubs on your neck bones? That's a crazy thing to do if you're not using them to fight. So actually Brian Eng and Mike Taylor and some others and I are working on that right now and hoping to publish on that in the near future. So Brachiosaurus is skinny and has long front legs and short back legs, and Apatosaurus is fat and had long back legs and short front legs.
All right, we have another question about the air pockets in the vertebrae.
Cool.
Aaron writes that I've heard that these air pockets in the vertebrae are related to air sacs. How do air sacs leave these pockets inside the bones?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. And I'm wishing that I would have put some pictures of that in, because that's usually what I yap about the most, is how does the air get into the bones? So our lungs are basically bags, and we breathe in, and the air sits there in the bags, and the oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged with our blood vessels, and we blow the air back out. So we get fresh air just when we inhale, and it just kind of sits there. In birds, they have air sacs on either side of their lungs. So when they breathe in, the air flows through their lungs, and some of the air bypasses the lungs and goes into air sacs. And then when they breathe out, that fresh air gets blown through the lungs as well. So bird lungs are really fancy, and they get a lot more oxygen out of the air than we do. So birds can take off and just fly up to like the cruising altitude of airliners, like 30,000 feet. And they don't have to go on supplemental oxygen. Meanwhile, climbers up in the Himalayas, like on Everest, are lower than that, and they have to be on oxygen bottles or they get hypoxic and start seeing yetis and hallucinating. And then bird lungs do this other cool thing. The lungs and air sacs send these little fingers of air throughout the body. They look kind of like bubble wrap. And sometimes you can see this. Sometimes if you have a fresh, uncooked turkey neck, you can actually open up the muscles and you can see little remnants of this bubble wrap in between the muscles and up against the bone. And those little air-filled fingers that connect to the respiratory system are how the air is getting from the torso, from the chest, out to the neck and out to the bones and the limbs. And you can see this in like a chicken wing or a turkey wing. The humerus, the upper arm bone, has usually a pretty big hole in it where the air was getting inside. So I encourage you, especially with the holidays coming up and the ready availability of chickens and turkeys, spend some time looking at their bones. And if you need a guide, go to SVPOW and go to things to make and do. And we've got some guidelines on how to safely look inside these bones and see some of these things for yourself.
All right, Julia Angeles wants to know how many dinosaur bones you have found, and is there a specific area that has so many fossils?
So I have not found a ton myself. I've found a few, but usually when I'm out in the field, I'm the one who's coming along with the notebook, like getting the GPS coordinates and making a little sketch and logging where and when. And usually it's the people walking ahead. And if Brian Eng is out with me, it's no contest. He moves way faster than I do. He will find the bones, and then I will come along and write them up. So personally, I haven't found very many dinosaur bones myself, although I have been on teams that found lots of dinosaur bones. So if I can take credit for the stuff that Brian Eng has found, then I've found, well, over 100. But if it's stuff that I found myself, it's probably just a handful. And as far as areas that have lots of dinosaur bones, the main thing that you need to find dinosaur bones is desert. You need to be able to see them. So it needs to not be covered in dirt and plants. Like this is one that I found actually, this thigh bone, because Brian and I and a couple of our colleagues were sitting under a juniper tree in some shade having lunch. And I pointed, I don't know, several hundred yards away to this white sandstone ledge, and there was something dark in it. And I said, hey, what's that dark thing in the white rock? We should walk over and check that out. We walked over there, and the dark thing was a dinosaur bone. One of the places that I dig is in the panhandle of Oklahoma, at a site that is excavated by a colleague of Dr. McHugh and myself, Dr. Ann Weil from Oklahoma State University, Tulsa. She has my job. She teaches anatomy at the med school there and also goes out and digs up dinosaurs. And in Oklahoma, it's a lot more challenging because it's dry, but it's not a straight up desert. And so there's still lots of grass and ground cover, and it makes it really hard to find the bones. So the quarry she's been working at, we're digging. Once you find one thing, then you can dig and you can uncover more. But if there was no grass on the ground, it would be a lot easier. So we tend to go to Utah, not because it's the only place to find dinosaurs, but because it's an easy place to find dinosaurs. And in particular, we're interested in these parts of the Morrison Formation that are way out on the edge of the basin. So sites like in the Oklahoma Panhandle and up in the Black Hills of South Dakota, are on the east edge of that basin. We're way out on the other side trying to figure out, was it all the same dinosaurs all the way across that formation? Are you going to find the same things in Utah that you find in South Dakota, that you find in Oklahoma? And there are some tantalizing suggestions that maybe it's not all the same dinosaurs all throughout the Morrison Formation. So we and lots of other folks are working on that problem right now. That's a hot area of research.
So Stephen writes, you illustrate several herbivores in the locale, but no theropods. Are the latter only represented by tooth marks? If yes, why do you suppose this is? And thank you for a great lecture.
Thank you, I appreciate that. We have found a few bits of theropods. We found at this site, there is a sandstone cliff like this that has a theropod skull in cross section. Including a couple of serrated teeth, but it doesn't look cool. Like when I say a theropod skull, you're like, oh, it'll be like the outline of an Allosaurus skull. It's cut like this. So you've got like just parts of the inside of the nose and stuff like that. It doesn't look very inspiring. And sadly, I cut it out of this talk for time. And we've also found a couple of theropod vertebrae. We haven't found any great evidence of theropods. So we know they were around, but it kind of makes sense because predators are always less common than prey. And at this site in particular, there seems to be almost a bias towards big bones. So we find almost no bones that are hand size or smaller. But we find lots of bones that are 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 feet long. So it seems like whatever combination of water and sediment was active here, whether it was flash floods, maybe flash floods after droughts, somehow the little bones were getting carried away or otherwise weren't getting preserved and the bigger bones were. So we're finding the big stuff, the big sauropods, and then also things like stegosaurs. We're not finding the little dinosaurs. And we're finding a few theropods, but not a lot, and nothing identifiable yet. So we assume that we're probably finding stuff like Allosaurus and Ceratosaurus, but we're not sure. It could be there's other weird, rare sauropods in the Morrison, things like Marchiosaurus, which is an early Tyrannosaur relative. So as much as I like to make fun of theropods, I would definitely take more and more identifiable theropod material if we could get it. It's just that right now what we're getting is sauropods.
Zach says, thanks for the talk. And then he has the question that you already answered about how air flows through sauropods and birds. He also asks, if I may sneak an extra question, how much lighter would sauropod bones be to similarly sized mammal bones?
That's a fantastic question. And that's something that I looked at in my dissertation. So the sauropod vertebrae are on average about 65% air and about 35% bone. And a comparable mammal bone, all that space would be filled with bone marrow. So which is mostly fat and water. So mammal bones, their overall density, so if the density of water is 1 gram per cubic centimeter or 1 kilogram per liter, mammal bones, marrow is about 0.95 or 1, and bone tissue, the dense bone, is about 2, a density of 2, so twice as dense as water. So the bone's going to be some mixture of those two. So mammal bones are usually around 1.5 or something like that. But sauropod bones and bird bones are made out of bone tissue, which is really dense, and air, which weighs almost nothing at all. So they can be way less dense than water. So the lightest one that I've measured myself, there are places in the vertebrae of Sauroposeidon that are about 90% air. So if it's 90% air and 10% bone, but the bone has a density of 2, then overall the density of that element is going to be about 0.2 grams per cubic centimeter, whereas in a mammal it would be like 1.6, so like 8 times heavier. Now, there is some recent research that suggests that even though their vertebrae were really light, their limb bones were pretty dense, and that overall sauropods might not have been any less dense than mammals, but they were getting that same result not by being the same density everywhere, which is more or less what we do, but by having really light vertebral column and really heavy limb bones. But they could potentially, the vertebrae could be way lighter, like somewhere between a sixth and an eighth of the density of mammal vertebrae.
Cool.
And birds are the same way. Pelican bones are crazy, crazy light. And their density is down there in the Sauroposeidon range of being like 90% air, 10% bone or less. Good questions.
Well, I have some gratis for you. So Terry says, thank you for an informative lecture and fun stories and photos. Rich, who's a friend of mine from grad school back at University of Iowa, hi Rich, says, awesome talk. Thanks for sharing your work. And let's see, Suzanne says, it's been a while since I've been around other dinosaur lovers. This is great. And then we have another question from Georgia. She wants to know if you've ever found a Mosasaurus.
I never have. So mosasaurs are seagoing lizards, actually. They're basically giant monitor lizards. Like imagine a Komodo dragon went out to the ocean and just never came back, that are found in the Cretaceous all across the world, but especially up and down the Great Plains of the United States, because that area was all underwater. So there are mosasaurs from like Oklahoma and Kansas, but I've never been out on a dig where we were exploring in ocean sediments. I'm always looking for stuff, fossils of animals that were on land. I don't have anything against it. I'd happily go dig one up. I just haven't had the opportunity yet.
And then we have a question from Steve. Steve says, if you could find any fossil of any sauropod in the Morrison, what would it be and why? A skull of Haplocanthosaurus would be my ideal.
So that's a deep cut from Steve, bringing up Haplocanthosaurus. So Haplocanthosaurus and Brachiosaurus, we only have maybe like 7 or 8 individuals of each one. Whereas for Camarasaurus, I think John Foster tallied that, all right, we don't have 200 complete skeletons, but we have bits and bobs here and there from at least 200 different individuals of Camarasaurus. For Apatosaurus and Diplodocus, it's over 100 individuals apiece. And then way down at the other end of the scale, we got Brachiosaurus and Haplocanthosaurus, each with a handful, like half a dozen maybe. Up until a couple years ago, I would have said I want to find a Brachiosaurus humerus, but I already got to have that dream come true. So at this point, a skull of Brachiosaurus would be great, a skull of Haplocanthosaurus. There are even weirder, rarer sauropods in the Morrison, like Suacia, which is a dicreosaurid. So it's kind of related to Diplodocus, but it's in this weird family of short-necked sauropods that tended to have high spines on their backbones. And most of the other dicreosaurs are from Africa or from South America. We have one from the Morrison. So I'd take some more Suacia. But you asked me point blank, I gotta give you my honest answer. I would take a complete Brachiosaurus skull from Brachiosaur Gulch. So we know, like we've got other parts of that same individual. That would be my dream find. And who knows, it could be waiting for us in the dirt. We're going to go back and have a look next summer.
Well, Matt, I have a question for you about Brachiosaurus Gulch. You were showing us all those fabulous pictures of different vertebrae in the various sandstone boulders. Are all of those sandstone boulders from the same sandstone unit, or are they spread out vertically through the gulch?
So that's a great question. We have about, I don't think I have any terribly wide photos of the landscape, but we get these massive sands that are separated by beds of mudstone and paleosol, which are ancient soils. And we have about 4 different layers of this thick sandstone. And we don't have a great control on how much time each one of those represents. But we find these bones in every one of those layers. But does each one of those layers represent 1,000 years or 10,000 years or 100,000 years? That's a tough call. So one of the things that John Foster's been working on just this year is kind of working out the local stratigraphy and tying it into published sections and crucially published dates from nearby. The Brachiosaur is from way down at the bottom of the Morrison at this site. So it is about as early as it is possible to be. And if we go back to Brachiosaur Gulch, so I don't know, I'll go to Tom's photo of when we're getting the rib out. So there's one of those massive sandstones, and there are other bones. I was actually working my way along this ledge, logging things in my notebook, when Brian called me over here to see the humerus back in 2019. So the humerus is the first thing that we found that's not coming out of sandstone. It's coming out of the mudstones in between the massive sandstones. But we're right down, I think there's one more bed of sandstone below us that we actually walk across, getting the big jackets out. But other than that, we're pretty close to the bottom of the Morrison period, and we're way out on the western edge of the basin. So this is definitely the westernmost Brachiosaurus, and we think it's probably the stratigraphically oldest too. And like the humerus and the rib are identifiable enough for us to be certain that it's Brachiosaurus, but if we found vertebrae, or if we found a skull, it might turn out that it's not the same species as the Brachiosaurus that we know and love from Colorado. So we're really hopeful that we'll get some of those bones that have a little bit more complexity that will tell us, is this just good old vanilla Brachiosaurus, which would be great, or could it possibly be a new species? We'll have to go find more stuff.
Cool. Let's see here. So we have another question from Georgia. She wants to be a paleontologist when she grows up. How can she do that?
So I wanted to be a paleontologist when I grew up, and I will tell you what I did, and it worked. So one thing that I did is I went to museums and I read dinosaur books, and that was just sort of stuffing my head with things that I needed to know that would come in handy later on. Do well in your science classes, even if they're challenging, because they will help you along the way. One of the things that I wish that I had done more of is comparative anatomy. So my colleague Mike Taylor had not much, if any, formal training in anatomy, but when we started this blog, he got interested in animal anatomy, and so most of the things in our things to make and do section on the blog are his projects, where at this point now people just know that he's interested in dead animals, and if they have an interesting dead animal, they will bring it to him and he will turn it into a skeleton. So one of the things that's on there, I've got a market not too far from the house that has sheep heads, because people like to make like barbecue or soup or whatever out of sheep heads. And so I can go get a sheep head for about $10 and skeletonize it and turn it into a skull, which is fun and looks cool. So doing that sort of stuff, acquainting yourself with the anatomy of animals. And it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't have to be anything exotic. You can get started with bones from chickens and turkeys. And even as you're eating chicken or eating turkey, you're eating muscle. And you can see how those muscles are attaching to the bones, and you can start learning about how animals are put together, including us and including dinosaurs. And I think that is interesting stuff in and of itself, and it's also great training for being an anatomist and being a paleontologist.
So
and then if there is a museum nearby, go volunteer at your local museum. That's how I got started. I started volunteering at the museum when I was in high school. And a paleontologist took me under his wing and showed me the ropes. So if there's a museum in your area, go see if they have a volunteer program. Go see if there's ways for civilians to get involved. And that can be your gateway.
So we have some more gratis. Stephen Yanis says, thank you, Dr. Wedel. Julia Angelis says, I enjoyed this talk a lot. Thank you for inspiring information about Brachiosaurus. Ariane says, thank you for this informative talk. And let's see here, Bianca says, thank you for sharing your deep knowledge with us. And then we have a question from Heather, who says, I'm an information technology professional. Is there a way I can use my IT skills to assist paleontologists?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. And the reason I say it's a fantastic question is because my colleague Mike Taylor, who I've mentioned several times, is a computer programmer, and he got interested in dinosaurs and started reading dinosaur books. And then he wrote to me and we started corresponding, and he started reading scientific papers. And eventually he knew enough that he wanted to start making contributions. So he started doing research, and eventually he even pursued a PhD, and now is Dr. Taylor. And he is a fully trained paleontologist, but he's not a professional paleontologist in the sense that he doesn't have a paying job in the field, but he is an active researcher, and his work is pretty well respected and well cited. So there are ways to use technical degrees like that, in particular with things like database work in paleontology, which I don't know very much about. But my recommendation, if you're in IT and you want to use your technical chops to assist paleontology, is probably go to SVPow and leave a comment for Mike and say, hey, how do I use my computer chops to advance the study of dinosaurs or whatever, and see what he says. Because I know just about enough about computers to have held up my end of this Zoom session, and to make figures for my papers, and that's about it. But I know people who know the answers, and I will be happy to help you find them.
John Alroy might be another good resource. If you go over to fossilworks.org or the paleobiology database, you can see some of the interactive collaborative data from paleontologists all over the world that they've been putting together to kind of reconstruct big level questions. And they always need people to help them with programming and databasing.
Awesome suggestion. Thank you.
Let's see, there's one more question in here. It's from Georgia. She wants to know, why were so many bones found in Brachiosaurus Gulch? Why were they all together? Was it a sinkhole that they got stuck in or something else?
Oh, that's a good question. So we have, so far from Brachiosaur Gulch, all the other bones that I showed, the Apatosaurus, the Apacanthosaurus, the Camarasaurus, they're spread over an area about a square mile. So they're not all together. We think that the dinosaurs were just sort of on the landscape, and probably on a floodplain, and then floods would come through, flash floods would come through and bury them, or they would fall into a river channel and get buried in the river channel. So in Brachiosaur Gulch specifically, in that canyon, we have found just the two humeri and the rib, and there was one other little piece of bone that we think might be part of the shoulder blade. And that's it so far. So we think that so far everything is consistent with it just being parts of a single individual. We've got the left and right humeri. They're almost exactly the same size. And we've got one rib from an animal of about that size. So the humerus that came with the type specimen of Brachiosaurus out of Colorado in 1900, its humerus is a little bit longer. I think it's about 4 inches longer than ours. It's like, I don't know, 6'10" instead of 6'6", something like that. And it has a rib that's 7 feet long. Our rib is 6 feet 4 inches. So all the evidence is that our Brachiosaur is just a little bit smaller, like 5% smaller maybe than that one, and that it is just one individual. What happens when we don't get to the bones in time, when erosion gets to them first, is that we walk up and just find exploded dinosaur bone kibble on the surface. And there is definitely some of that tumbling down the slope over here. And you can find little isolated chunks of bone down in the wash. So we're hopeful that there is more Brachiosaurus in here around the hole. But it's possible that most of the rest of the skeleton was over here and has already gotten destroyed by erosion. And the only way to find out for sure is to go back and dig more. So that's definitely on the to-do list for next year, provided that no more global pandemics or horrendously weird weather interferes.
We can only hope. So Georgia also wants to know if you've ever named a dinosaur. And we had the 3 that we mentioned earlier, Sauroposeidon, Brontomirus, and Aquilops, but were any of those your idea?
So Sauroposeidon was my advisor for my undergraduate research and my master's thesis back at the University of Oklahoma, Rich Cifelli. We didn't know that it was a new dinosaur when he gave me the job of working on it. And had we known it was a new dinosaur and that it was going to be that exciting, it probably would have gone to somebody with a little bit more of a track record than I had, since I had none at all. That was my first research project ever. But after about a semester of working on that, we figured out that it was a new dinosaur. And then that became Sauroposeidon. So I was the one who had the realization that it was a new dinosaur and also came up with the name. Brontomirus is an interesting case because it was a colleague of mine, Ray Wilhite, who suggested that one of the bones of the pelvis from that animal was really weird and interesting. So he was the one who realized that it was probably new. And then Mike Taylor and I and Rich Cifelli looked at it and worked it up. And Mike and I kind of came up with the name together. And then Aquilops, a little horned dinosaur, that was another project with Rich Cifelli and Des Maxwell. They found the fossil. They realized that it was new. Andy Farkey, Dr. Farkey, who's a colleague of mine who works at the Alf Museum here in Claremont. He's actually the director of that museum now. He kind of helped take the original description that Rich and Des wrote and update it. He'd had the opportunity to go to China and see a lot of the relatives of that thing from China and Mongolia. But I think that Rich and Des had already come up with the name Aquilops, which means eagle face. Brontomirus we're really proud of. It means thunder thigh, because that animal had really big hip bones and would have had massive thighs. And Sauroposeidon I'm still proud of. Poseidon was the god of the sea, but also the god of earthquakes. So Sauroposeidon means lizard earthquake god. But those are the three for me so far. I'm always hopeful that some new dinosaur will come along and need a name. But the only way to find that out is to keep doing the work.
Well, awesome. I think we've reached the end of our existing chat. Are there any other questions that are out there for anybody? Be happy to take more now.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. It has been a real pleasure getting to talk about my favorite subjects. Thank you for indulging me. I usually have to hunt people down and pester them to talk to them about dinosaurs. So I'm really glad to get to do this. Many thanks to Dr. McHugh and to the Museum of Western Colorado for inviting me. It's been an honor and a pleasure. And I hope that you will all go out and seek out Brachiosaurus and also take a hard look at the next chicken or turkey that you come across, because it's a dinosaur and it's got real weird dinosaur bits inside, and you should get to see that for yourself.
Well, I think we all have big dinner plans hopefully coming up in the next couple months. So we'll definitely have to dissect our turkeys like good scientists.
There you go.
If any of you guys are in the Western Colorado area, you can go to Riggs Hill, which is the type locality for the Brachiosaurus from 1900. There are hiking trails there. The museum actually owns the property, so it is open for the public to enjoy. And we also have a couple of geocaching trails out there. So you can use your detective skills and your GPS that's in your magic phone to find the boxes and learn more about the geology and the paleontological history of the area. So that's a fun thing to do. It is Earth Science Week, so get out there and enjoy geology, enjoy paleontology. And thank you guys for sticking with us through the talk and through all the Q&A. We really appreciate you guys hanging around for the end of the talk, and have a great rest of your evening. And thank you to Dr. Wedel.
Thanks, folks. See you out there. Going out and doing things on their own and